Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the session on Trade and Services Partnership. I know it's the last session of the day, but it actually is such a great segue because before this you've done sessions on education and you did one on tourism. I think that the natural ending is really to bring in the entire gamut of trade and services and the partnership in the ASEAN region. So the trade and services between our two countries, if you see India and Singapore, is substantial and it covers several sectors, including transportation, especially financial and insurance sectors, tourism, construction, telecom, computer services, and business services. Unlike trade in goods, India exports of services to Singapore appear to have seen a steady growth, particularly propelled by our exports in IT and IT-enabled services. India, however, continues to be substantially trade deficit, especially if you include travel services. In fact, 2014 is the last data point that was taken, and the exports to Singapore amounted to 3.6 billion, whereas the imports from Singapore was 4.3 billion. So what's the way ahead? It's been noticed that there were certain issues that needed to be addressed to spur further expansion of bilateral trade and services. These include movement of natural persons, regulation of banks, and concluding mutual recognition agreements in respect of certain professional areas as mandated by CECA. Let me now expand on these issues. It's slightly technical, but I'll just get into the broad portion of this. We have experts here who will go much deeper. So the mutual recognition agreements, the MRAs, early action for mutual recognition agreements to be reached in the areas of accounting, architecture, dental, and medical services, preferably within a year. The immediate commencement of implementation of the MRA on nursing that has already been concluded from both sides. In fact, my company has been working on this for quite some time, and we're looking forward to be able to do this on a regional basis. Banking. There are concerns among some of the Indian banks in Singapore that the norms prescribed for them in respect of permitted asset size, asset management ratios, and other functional parameters are significantly limiting their operations. It may be a good idea for the regulatory authorities of India, the Reserve Bank, and the Monetary Authority of Singapore to have regular exchange of views about regulatory issues so that this compliance and business expansion can proceed harmoniously. And moving on to the movement of natural persons. It's very important to bring more predictability in the regulatory aspect regarding employment passes, particularly in relation to Indian banks and IT companies in Singapore. A bilateral understanding needs to evolve, keeping in view SICA commitments. Indian companies may also need to be seen as making an effort to increase local recruitment of personnel, and greater public outreach about these efforts may also be helpful. Transportation. In air services, Indian carriers have talked about proper slotting as an issue at the Singapore end, but it may need attention. As you know, the reciprocity in this is really an issue because most Indian airports now are at full capacity, whereas the traffic that has been generated, if you just take air travel for instance, over the last 3 years, India has actually moved up 100% in air travel, and this has put a huge pressure on most of the airports. And so the airports, if you see, regional airports are now asking for international connectivity, but it has to be two ways. There have to be enough Indian carriers that can improve connectivity. As you know, on the back of most of the hubs of Singapore first and then Dubai, it's mostly the Indian travelers that have created these hubs and then moving on to Abu Dhabi. It's now the Indian government is seeing how they can actually rationalize and move this across. So travel is just one area, but if you look at it, again, we talk about the relationships and trade partnerships, healthcare, which was just discussed as I came in, is another deep area where this region is necessary to participate together. If you see, Indonesia exports almost $700 million of healthcare trade to Singapore and this region. India, it accounts to, it's actually the biggest foreign exchange earner in terms of tourism now. So in all these areas, you'll see that the importance of our region being together. And today, I'm very pleased to introduce to you, so these are just my opening remarks, that the potential of a partnership, if you see in every country, now there are very few countries where manufacturing is as important as it was in the last century. In India, 60%, more than 60% of our GDP comprises of services, and this is true in most countries, especially Singapore. So joining me on this panel is a very distinguished list of, first, Mr. K.V. Rao. He's the Resident Director, ASEAN of Tata Sons, Singapore. Mr. Yusuf Ali, he's the Chairman and Managing Director of the Lulu Group International. And as you know, that's a household name in most of the Middle East, and now also in India, and he has operations spanning most of the world. So Mr. Vijay Iyengar, who's based in Singapore, is Chairman and Managing Director of AgroCorp International Private Limited. And as I was walking up, he said, you know, today it's really about agri and food processing, which is the flavor of possibly the next, of this coming financial, and for the next 2-3 years, India is going to really concentrate on how we can improve farmer productivity and trading and food security. We also have Mr. Amol Titus, based out of Indonesia. Mr. Titus is the President and Director of Indonesia WISE, and he's the President of the Indian Chamber of Commerce of Indonesia. And last, we have Ms. Sanchita Basudas. She's the fellow lead researcher, Economic Affairs of the ASEAN Studies Center and Coordination, Singapore APEC Study Center in Singapore. So as you know, we have a great mix of business, of entrepreneurs, and of technical experts here with us. So I'm going to let them speak for 5 minutes. After that, we'll have some Q&A, and then we'll open it to the audience. But we'll definitely keep within the time limit. Thank you again. So first up, shall we go in the order? And Sanchita, sure. Please. Yes, of course. And it's your choice, if you'd like to speak from here or come up and use the podium for your 5 minutes. Please feel free.
Is this yours?
Sorry?
Is this yours?
No.
Oh, okay. Leaving it here. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Ms. Chair, for your warm introduction. And like she said, I work in Singapore for a think tank, ICS Yusuf Ishak Institute. We are established by Singapore during its chairmanship of ASEAN in 2007. And our mandate is to do research on regional economic integration, paying special focus to ASEAN. So ASEAN and ASEAN-related activities are very close to my heart. So thank you to High Commission of India, Singapore today for doing this big event and for introducing me to this esteemed panelist and to all of you today. I will focus on 2 aspects for ASEAN-India relation, and that will be like, how does ASEAN-India relation stands in the context of this Asian region? And the second is, what are the upsides going forward in the ASEAN-India relation? So in the context, the region context, ASEAN-India relation is, in terms of trade and investment, is relatively low, especially when we are talking about ASEAN-China, ASEAN-Korea, ASEAN-Japan. ASEAN-India, like for very simple example is the trade. The mercantile trade is only 60 billion compared to, say, of South Korea, which is around 150 billion, Japan 250 billion, and China 345 billion. But that's okay. India is a very different animal. You cannot say, oh, being an elephant is wrong. You have to always be a tiger, or you have to be a dragon. No, there is no necessary. And your shape, size, everything matters because it's influenced by your politics, your economics, and your social structure. So India's approach to trade policy is very different from these countries. India entered to this globalization process only in 1990s, whereas China came in this process in late 70s. Japan came in this process in the post-World War II, and ASEAN in the late 1980s. So India is a pretty latecomer in this regionalization drive or this globalization drive. And what India missed by this is it missed the core of international trade at this moment, which is the production network. Now the manufacturing sector, they no longer produce one goods in one country. They divide their production across multiple countries. So India, the manufacturing sector is not competitive in India, or the agriculture sector. And for these two sectors, the domestic market is big enough to get the income. So what is competitive in India is the services sector. And this is where is again the mismatch of interest. ASEAN's interest in the economy or for trade is merchandise trade, goods trade, whereas India's interest is in services trade. So we see like for ASEAN-India trade negotiation, it took almost 6 years. And even the investment and the services, it took much longer than that. Now, moving to the second aspect of my presentation is why do I see a huge upside from here? This is because if I see the period from 2000 to 2015, when ASEAN and India, they have started talking, or for say China, Japan, they have started talking about this institutional relationship, the growth, the trade in goods has grown around 13% per annum. This is against like 8% growth for ASEAN. So, and if we see who are the top trading partners for India, ASEAN is in number 4. So it's US, China, EU, and then ASEAN. So basically, going forward, ASEAN is going to remain very pertinent in India's trading basket. For the services, again, ASEAN and India together, they grab 10% of the global market. And Singapore, India, the leading commercial services exporters. And there are a lot of complementarities. For the ASEAN countries, they have huge competitive advantage in the tourism and travel. Whereas if we see in India, they have comparative advantage in sectors like construction, financial services, telecommunication, and of course, the ICT. And if we see from the anecdotal evidence, we see that ICT and related professional business services, financial services, logistics, education, healthcare, travel and tourism, these are the constant things that are exchanged in between these two parties. And we have the new discussion in the policy circle now about digital economy, e-commerce, smart cities, and I think, again, ASEAN and India can play a very important role. Lastly, if I see the investment, again, even though investment number is very low for ASEAN-India, especially from India to ASEAN, but if we see ASEAN as an investment destination for India, it's around 22% of total India's overseas FDI. And if we compare it with Japan, it's 13%. For China, it's 6%. So ASEAN is relatively very important in India's overall going abroad for the investment. And if we see, because till now I'm talking about ASEAN, if we see for individual economies, of course there are differences. And most often what features in India, in ASEAN's context for India is Singapore. So Singapore is a gateway for Indian investment or trade to ASEAN. And this is followed by Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam is also fast rising. There are around 2,000 Indian firms that are operating in these countries. And there are many factors that has contributed to this: trade agreement, double taxation avoidance treaty, connectivity. I won't touch much on the connectivity as we have an entire panel on connectivity just before this one. The other factor that matters in ASEAN-India relation is the Indian diaspora in the ASEAN countries, and we cannot ignore this. Lot of the investment and trade between ASEAN and India happens because of that diaspora. And yes, like the earlier panel mentioned, like both ASEAN and India is adopting connectivity as its strategic policy for relationship. And a lot is happening in that part also. Last but not the least, India is undertaking a lot of domestic reforms, like Make in India, Skill India, Smart Cities, Digital India. So a lot of slogans are gone. And this is acknowledged in the ASEAN-India Summit that these are going to play a huge role in building ASEAN-India relation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sanchita. That was, very crisp but super comprehensive. And I picked up some good thoughts and actually some follow-up questions, which I'm going to save for later. May I now ask Mr. Vijay Iyengar to address?
I'm going to sit here and speak, if you don't mind.
That's just perfect.
It's really an honor and privilege to be on this panel this afternoon. One of the comments in the earlier session that the moderator made was that this was the first time that a PBD had been conducted in Singapore. I have to disagree with him. Under the Indian Chamber of Commerce, we had conducted a PBD in 2008, and at that time we had the absolute honor of having Mr. Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew speak to us about his thoughts on the Singapore-India and the Indian-ASEAN relationship, and we had old friends like Mr. Yusuf Ali who attended, and I've seen him in many, many PBDs since then. So we have a whole batch of senior business men who tend to go from one PBD to another, and it blends its own. It gives us connectivity and a lot of fellowship over the years, and CII and FICCI has regularly supported these events. I think right from the morning we've heard a lot of speakers speak about the Indian-ASEAN relationship. Some of them have commented on the trade relationship as it stands. Figures have been spoken about. But I think we must examine the Look East policy and the background of the Look East policy. I think it's something that's come up in the context of the Belt and Road, active Belt and Road policy that China has really espoused in the last few years. And then you've had the US sort of retreating from its commitment for global free trade. And I think that really prompts a policy response from India. And I think the Look East policy, the ASEAN FTA, and the RCEP are all measures that will stand India in good stead in the years to come. Having said that, I think one of the things that I want to focus on, because we have a panel of 6 eminent panelists, and really I want to focus on the sector that I'm familiar with, which is the food and agri sector. If you look at what's happening in India over the last year and a half, there has been a lot of attention that the policymakers in India want to place on improving the rural economy. And when they talk about improving the rural economy, they want to concentrate on the agri sector. And this is a sector which today Mr. Gadkari also in the morning in his speech mentioned, and I think Amitabh Kant also referred to it. So every policymaker in India is concerned about the rural economy and what they have to do to uplift the members of the rural economy. And we earlier, right through the day, everybody has been speaking about the current economic recovery or the current economic progress in India, which is leaving out, which is really a jobless recovery. And the jobs are going to be created in the rural economy and in the rural sector. And really that's an area that I think the policymakers will have to focus on. And there's going to be a lot of opportunity in that particular area, particularly because I think India has been focusing. There's been a lot of attention that's been made and paid to the rural economy. And I think this year's budget, which is going to be the last budget before their election in 2019, is going to give a lot of sops to the rural economy. So really, I think there is going to be opportunity. There are major ASEAN food companies which would be interested to participate. India is talking about mega food parks where there is a government investment subsidy as well. There's going to be lots of, I think, if you look at what's happening in the rural economy in India, there's a post-harvest loss of close to 15 to 20%. We are talking about a figure of 13 to 15 billion dollars that is lost immediately after harvest, from harvest to storage to the market. So that's a huge figure. And if everybody concentrates on that particular area, there's money to be made. I mean, companies will not invest unless there is an economic advantage. And there's lots of economic advantage. And if policymakers really focus on that particular aspect, there is lots of things that can be done with companies in ASEAN who have gone through this process maybe 30, 40 years ago. I think the government has gone through various policy measures like 100% FDI in food processing, 100% FDI in retailing of food products which are produced and manufactured in India. But one of the things that recently we've had to bear with, and this is something which has affected some of the trade flows between India and ASEAN, is India has been imposing tariffs as well as non-tariff measures on food imports and the food sector as well. And I think they're missing a beat on that, because essentially tariffs, maybe yes, they can be short-term, but non-tariff barriers are some things which perhaps the authorities could do well without looking at. And this is something which has impacted their business. And this has impacted ASEAN countries. Lots, if you look at their immediate neighbor, the connectivity that India has in terms of land borders with Myanmar. There are ambitious talks about road connectivity with Myanmar, and this leads into Thailand as well. There is the Kaladan intermodal transport hub that has been built up as well. And let me tell you, there is a good demand for Indian products. We ourselves distribute Indian-made two-wheelers within Myanmar, and we are competing with manufacturers from Japan and China, and we are getting good traction. And these are the kind of things which, and recently India put in place some tariffs on 50% of Myanmar agriculture exports, which really affected the two-way trade. Looking at that policy response, a lot of us could understand the need for it, because there was some agrarian distress in India, and there was a need for it from the Indian point of view. But perhaps these things could have been handled better in consultation with Myanmar. And the policy measure that was impacted was basically non-tariff in nature. Tariff policy measures, people can understand. It's something that you can take it into your costing. That's something that you can work with. But non-tariff measures were something that the Myanmar side took. There was some amount of to and froing between India and Myanmar on that side. I think there is lots of areas that Myanmar and India could work on. India and ASEAN could work on. Recent trends in the food business point to a need for traceability for food, and blockchain, a buzzword that everybody is talking about, will enable consumers to dictate personal choices in food. And that's something which the Western world is coping with. Every consumer in the Western world is looking at personalizing their food preferences. And this is something which India, if they're really concentrating on the agrarian sector, they want to build up their capability in production, capability in storage, capability in export. That's something with the Indian IT capability, that's something which India will be well served to look at. I think the other areas in the other countries in the ASEAN that you've been, am I running out of time? I think some of these things we can talk about during our panel discussion, but I think there are multiple opportunities for Indo-ASEAN trade in goods and services. India is a giant in the information technology sector, and there is much that Indian companies can do in the ASEAN. Events like this actually as the potential for unleashing diaspora connectivity in the mix, which points to a very interesting period ahead for India and ASEAN. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that, but
No worries.
it's important to understand, and you were talking about FTAs, this has come up many times. Yesterday we were with the Prime Minister, again, of Singapore. The subject has come up that they're looking at it. One thing is that what ways in every country we've gone to, where they talk about India's inability to conclude FTAs. I think it largely stems from our economic, the disparity in our economic population, so that we have to really serve for the ones that, food security. And these are big issues, so when you touch on that, we're still not able to get our head around them. But more interesting is that now we're trying to work on harmonization. And I think that's an interesting subject among the ASEAN countries, if we can get to some certain standards on this. But moving on, I'd like to invite Mr. Titus to speak to us. Want to use this? Sure.
Good evening, Madam Chair, very distinguished speakers, and kalau ada saudara dari Indonesia, selamat sore, salam sejahtera. So I'm actually coming from Indonesia, and there was a comment earlier about we need to have a little bit of flavor of different ASEAN countries. So my presentation will look at Indonesia as a case for services, because I will try and show you how a country like Indonesia offers us a fantastic opportunity for Indian services sector to penetrate ASEAN in a big way. So if I can have my slides, please. If you can just load my slide. Yeah, just load the slide, the PDF. Yeah. Okay, so the first, yeah, go on to the next. Yeah.
Should have put it here.
Right. Thank you. Maybe I'll use your help to just move it, yeah?
Tight timeline.
Okay, so the first information I'll try and share with you is, where are these ASEAN countries excluding Singapore? In the next slide. So if you look at most of them, they are around 5% growth. Indonesia, around 5%. Vietnam is doing a little bit better. Philippines, a little bit of a yo-yo effect. So they are in the range of 5 to 6%. Next slide. What is happening here is, in this growth, the services sector, and I think Madam Shobna mentioned about large dominance of services in Singapore, but Singapore is a small country. Even if you look at the other ASEAN countries, look at an example like tourism sector. It is absolutely critical now for countries like Thailand, even Indonesia, because they are finding that their competitive advantage in manufacturing doesn't exist. Agriculture is subject to vagaries of weather, climate change, and severe competition from countries like Australia and New Zealand, which have fantastic hygiene standards, great brand name, and have already created huge appeal amongst the ASEAN region. And that is also a huge challenge then for Indian companies, which would be way down if they wanted to come in with agricultural products. It is possible, but it's, as we've seen in Indonesia, quite difficult to do. So that brings us to services as the opportunity. Next. So if you look at Indonesia, for example, in the last few years, the growth has been largely because of construction. So the country has been doing lots of construction, but more or less, the construction after a period of time hits saturation. So a place like Jakarta has got 175 malls. So Jakarta in Asia has the highest number of malls, and now many of those malls are empty. So services has to be the next kicker. And why I'm saying that is, for example, in Indonesia today, most companies spend 80% of their IT spending on hardware and hardly 20% on software and solutions. And in future, there is no choice but to start spending on software. Next. So let's look at Indonesia. Where is the government today prioritizing? They are talking about the same themes which India has been talking about: financial inclusion, remote area connectivity, skills development. These are the same themes, the same priorities which President of Indonesia has. So the experiments which are going on in India have a tremendous relevance here. So if we have solutions in the services sector, they have tremendous relevance in ASEAN. Next. So let's look at, there was some commentary about, great entrepreneurs from the West. People are talking of Elon Musk. But I'll leave you with 3 names. If you just Google them tonight: Gojek, Indonesia-grown motorcycle taxi service. Huge success story in the startup space. Traveloka, Indonesia-grown web-based travel service. Huge success story. Bukalapak. So these now are several billion dollars in valuation. So there is a lot of action taking place even in countries like Indonesia. Next, please. So our exports, India's IT services exports, $120 billion. But sorry to say, the percentage to a country like Indonesia are minuscule. So you have the big opportunity, you have this growth taking place, but of this amount, still very much dominated by the West, maybe countries like Japan, maybe Middle East. ASEAN does not figure in a big way. Next. So what happened? I call it the Invest, Develop, Skills Transfer Model, IDST. Indonesia is not a market where you can get off a plane and say, give me $1 million contract, or I will service you from Chennai or Bangalore. So this is the intelligence now Indian companies have to figure out. Act as investors. Just like the Birlas have a $2 billion business from Indonesia. Lohias have a $1.5 billion. So act as investors. Invest, localize, develop call centers. There is no call center from an IT company in Indonesia. Not even one. And this is a huge service economy. So that is the model which has to be followed. Second, scale up the value chain, because the basic level of services are already very much there. They are looking for higher value add. Customers are quite demanding. Focus on a relationship-based approach. As we know very well, in countries like Indonesia, Thailand, it's a relationship-based society rather than a transaction-based society. And don't copy-paste. I have an interesting story where I remember sitting in a presentation. I had introduced one IT firm, and the guy presented for 1 hour on post-dated checks. And the Indonesian guys listened to him very quietly, very humbly, at the end of which they said, there are no post-dated checks. We don't have checks in our country. So he had come with a solution from India where post-dated check solution is very important for motorcycle financing and so on and so forth. But he wasted his 1 hour, right? Similarly, on medical tourism, big opportunity. However, if you don't have connectivity by Air India, the lady was there in the previous session, what medical tourism are you talking about, right? So we don't have an integrated solution, just like patients are able to hop on to a flight and come to Singapore or Penang, right? So we've got to have an integrated end-to-end solution. Next, please. Yeah, just last slide. Okay, and the nuance. So the nuance, if you see here in e-commerce, you have Indonesia, cash on delivery, right? Another country is credit card, another country is internet banking. So you've got to understand, between ASEAN, very, very different countries. And the last slide. So a good presentation must end with a punch, and this is my punch. This year, in 9 months, 10 months, India-Indonesia trade, there is a deficit of $10 billion. So India is minus $10 billion with Indonesia, because we are buying their coal, we are buying their palm oil, but we are not being able to sell anything. So this is the opportunity we have, but also a challenge for us, because this, according to me, is not healthy. It's a one-way street, and the services sector Not Indian manufacturing, not Indian agriculture, will probably take a little bit of time. But in the near future, G2G focus has to be on services, IT, medical tourism, and breaking through those barriers through what you mentioned in terms of regulatory. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to talk to you later about that.
Actually, so many fascinating points. Thank you so much in bringing the Indonesia perspective. And apologies to my panelists here that I'm the bad cop. We started out, I think, because the last session went over time, so they took it off ours. So I think that please bear with me that I think that the gentleman here and lady have such good thoughts. We have to let them go through with them. So thank you for sharing that. I'd now like Mr. Rao to talk to us. He is a 25-year veteran of being in Singapore, representing an Indian company that has interests from safety pins to space.
So I think safety that and space. In between, we are there in everything.
In
else.
everything, absolutely, and especially in services. So, would you please like to talk to everyone?
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, dear audience, being here for the last session. I think it's an extremely rewarding feeling to see that the hall is full towards the last still. I'll try and restrict to my 5 minutes given time. I'll make some broad points. The theme we should not forget. The theme is to expand the scope of trade and services between ASEAN and India. And to look at that after morning session on digital disruption and artificial intelligence, we still were running out for our lunch because we wanted to fill our stomach and we wanted to quench our thirst because these are things which are not filled by digital disruption or artificial intelligence yet. You need food that Vijay supplies, you need electricity, power that perhaps startups do, and you need vehicles, you need movement. So the reality of trade and services should never be undermined as the last session actually, but always the best thing comes in the last. So I do believe that it's an important session on which we need to apply our minds. How do you expand? I remember in 2010, I read an article when I used to work in the, a period of time that I was involved with the government of Singapore, that ASEAN-India trade potential by a research agency was $280 billion. We are nowhere near that. So with 2 billion people, why is it that we can't get where we want to get? So obviously we need to understand what are the underlying factors today. I'll come up with 4 fundamental paradigm shifts in the manner in which we look at goods and services. The whole distinction of goods and services is very dated. It's a 1960s definition. And by the time I graduated, it started blurring. And today, you can never find out what is actually a good and what is a service. It is a mix of both. And it's not the conventional definition. And you can't have a binary negotiation in trade. And actually, they were having trade negotiations on the floor up there. Therefore, you could hear the voice earlier. You see the sound that's coming? Usually, trade negotiations are like that. There's a lot of rumble. There is a sound, much more than actually the significance that comes out of it. So when you negotiate, can you go and negotiate that I will buy a car from you if you buy the IT system from me? It never happens. Because they're not binary. They're completely different things to do. And therefore, it's very important in trade negotiations how you really distinguish the two of them because the needs could be different. We are talking about multilateralism and cooperation and trade agreements at a time where TPP has failed and what we call the Trump effect has taken over the world today. The Trump effect is I, me, myself, and nobody else. And that's a very difficult kind of a move to move away from. The most important thing that needs to be borne in mind is all trade is not something new that we created in 2000. Trade has happened for 2,000 years since the moment evolution started. If you read the theory of international economics, it is about interdependence, it is about resource allocation, it is about what you cannot actually do but what you need. It's not just about what you wish. Can India do away with 157 million tons of coal that it actually imports from Indonesia? How are you going to run your plants with it? If you're not going to get Indonesian palm oil, how is India going to do that? So sometimes when you do trade negotiations, we need to bear the reality of the matter. If you're talking about services and you're talking about services to be sent, it is not only about IT. Haircutting is also a service, beauticians is a service, optometrists is a service, staff on ships is a service. There are a whole lot of services that India can provide. But when you're talking about education and others, there are language barriers, culture barriers, and so on and so forth. So there are a whole lot of other areas that come into it. The last but not the least, as far as the fourth paradigm shift is, when you're looking at products, it's not products any longer. Either you're a component, you're a part of a supply chain, as you mentioned, or you are at a complete delivery model. Let's just take a pause. International trade, when I passed out maybe some 35, 38 years ago, was the biggest revolution was 20 by 20, 20 by 40, the boxes that came, which are called the containerization of break bulk cargo. Today it is a de-agglomerization. Today world trade moves in the size of 2 inches by 2 inches, 4 inches by 4 inches, and 1 foot by 1 foot, which comes in the form of air parcels to you on e-commerce. When e-commerce happens at $100 or lower or $300 and lower, there is no trade law that comes into it. There is no customs duty on it. There is no tax on it. There are billions of dollars of trade that's happening, which has actually surpassed far before the policymakers can think about it. I'd just like to, these are some of the trends that we need to bear in mind. And the first thing I would say is, how do you look at trade and services? Traditionally, we've looked at trade and services for past history. We see through the rear view mirror of our cars. We see what's coming from the past. I would strongly recommend the new world order, you've got to use your binoculars to look at what's going to happen and see how you're going to get there. And this brings me to the point of how can we remodel this trade logic? And I fully agree with what Shobhana has said, but I've read very carefully parliamentary committee meetings that have been held in India in August before the India-ASEAN trade. And it sometimes gives me a little anxiety because I think the realism of India is understood. But the manner in which the whole rhetoric is built about trade negotiations is, it is complementarity. Let us sit down and find how we can do it, because sometimes there is a certain level of inflexibility that is getting built into the negotiations, which is not going to build the kind of trust that India also needs because of the size of the market that it is, and the kind of opportunity that India has in ASEAN with 2 billion people. I think there is a need for a much greater, what I would call, economic pragmatism. There has to be a political will and economic pragmatism if global trade has to prosper. When either or of them or neither of them are there, I think it comes back to a situation of insularity. And therefore, I'd strongly recommend that we need to look at the whole business of doing this trade with a new set of lenses of how we can remodel it. Just to give an example, if you're looking at e-commerce, the amount of work that has happened in it in terms of services, if you buy a $2 item on your mobile phone today, the kind of intelligence that comes with it, the kind of information that comes with it is entirely offshoreable. The kind of e-commerce boom that's happening in ASEAN is something that could be offshored out of India, it could be done out of India, it could be arbitrated out of India, a whole lot of elements of intelligence that can be built into it. I would also like to touch upon 4 items before I go out of it, in the sense of ASEAN, what can ASEAN do in India? ASEAN can do a lot good in the area of packaged foods, for instance, because there's a lot of area of expertise here. The biggest thing that ASEAN companies have done in India today is actually foot massage that you get in all, many cities in India and airports. Lifestyle services, which have been better here, can go to India because there's 1.4 billion people. So the opportunities are huge, and services also that ASEAN companies can provide in India. The flip of it, if you look at medical services, and Shobhana sitting here, I think the value at which we can deliver high quality medical services to the ASEAN region, and all of ASEAN is not the same economic sweep of the same set of capabilities or economic standards. There is the whole the entire CMEA countries where you have your Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, even Thailand to some extent. There's a huge opportunity for us, including Indonesia and so on. The other last thing that I would like to leave behind as a thought process for ASEAN is, as I said, there are certain things which are needed and necessary and you cannot live without it. India will continue to import that, and ASEAN will continue to import that base level. But there are areas which are optional where we can build, which is the area of value-added manufactured products. For instance, India's capabilities in automobiles has been fairly global standard in terms of value for money positioning. We are in automobiles ourselves. And if you want to bring commercial vehicles at a value that makes sense to an Indonesia or a Thailand or to the rural communities, there is a disadvantage there. I think there are areas and elements and strands in which I think there has to be a lot more pragmatism in our trade negotiations. And with my due respects to to our bureaucrats, I think the industry has to work much closely with the bureaucrats to soften the stands, because having a good argument is an Indian trait. We love to argue for the sake of it, whether we agree or disagree. I think we need to also learn to have an argument and shake hands and say we are in with a deal. And I really wish that all that we're doing today leads up to ASEAN India, the next round, and RCEP discussion. And last but not the least, take some pragmatism on RCEP. To me, RCEP is actually a cricket team with 16 players, and 6 or 7 of them are actually hockey players in it. And imagine if you're playing a 16-people game, and you have got 2 or 3 sumo wrestlers there, and one is 800 pound in there, which you know who it is, and the other is 500 pound, but very, very articulate and loud, and has got its own strong views. And then you've got one agile, extremely agile acrobat in it. You can imagine which countries they are, because I don't want to name them. So you can see the amount of joy and how much of pleasure they're having trying to play that game. That's exactly what's happening in RCEP. But I suppose there will be this pragmatism that will come. And if we do not go for this, I think it's not just one country, it's not just one region, but I think a third of mankind is going to lose out. Because that's the power of this RCEP that can be held, and the power of an ASEAN-India deal is tremendous. So with that, I'll close my comments.
Very wise. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Rao. And probably not a cricket team as you developed, but it sounded more like a circus.
Pardon me?
RCEP sounds like a circus. But I think that the importance of it cannot be denied, and India is looking at it very seriously. The last speaker is, and it's always good when Mr. Yusuf Ali gets the last word.
The first and the last stand up to speak.
Madam Shofana, President, CII, my respected co-panelists, friends, brothers and sisters. As a last speaker, I'll speak only 3 minutes, because I thank, for a change, I thank the Government of India for organizing Pravasi Bharatiya Divas to strengthen the engagement of the overseas Indian community with the government, reconnect them with their roots, and celebrate their achievements and contributions. I also thank government and the organizers for organizing this special regional Pravasi Bharatiya Divas in this beautiful city of Singapore to commemorate 25 years of partnership between India and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, which is based on centuries-old cultural, religious, and human links, trade on ancient road and commerce. I'm very happy to have attended, rightly my friend Mr. Iyengar mentioned, the mini PBD in the same country during October 9 to 11 in the year 2008, which was indeed a great success, and I thank the government's organizing event in partnership with Singapore Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry and Confederation of Indian Industry during that time. This beautiful country, Singapore, at the heart of ASEAN, and has extraordinary and vibrant Indian diaspora, which is an important part of Southeast Asia's diversity and a strong bridge between India and ASEAN. I'm sure this PBD will highlight the ancient bonds between India and ASEAN, how the diaspora will be a part of new journey in the 21st century. Now I'll come to the subject. India-ASEAN trade and investment relations have been growing steadily, with ASEAN being India's 4th largest trading partner, rightly my co-panelist mentioned. India's trade with ASEAN has increased to $70 billion in 2016-17 from $65 billion in 2015-16. India's export to ASEAN ASEAN has increased US $31.7 billion in 2016-17 from US 25 billion in 2015-16. Investment flows are also substantial both ways, with the ASEAN accounting for approximately 12.5% of investment flows into India since 2000. FDI inflows into India from ASEAN between 2000 to 2017 was about US $514.73 billion, while FDI outflows from India to ASEAN countries from April 2007 to March 2015 was about $38.672 billion. Now the trade between India and ASEAN is growing. The strong economic growth of India has opened up many business possibilities, and there are plenty of opportunities for Indian firms to partner with Asian firms. Development, currently there are firms, both India and ASEAN, that are interested to expand or outsource their project each other. One of the prominent trends of the recent years of the world economy and the international economic relations is for trade in services to grow larger. On account of the language barrier and other factors, Indian companies have traditionally engaged in the business transactions mainly with Western companies, but recently taking advantage of swelling demand, and they are doing recently taking more business with Japan, China, and other Asian countries. So as our group, I would like to introduce our group also as a chance to best known our chain Lulu Hypermarket and shopping malls in the GCC, Egypt, India, Indonesia, and Malaysia with an annual turnover of 7 billion. We have a staff strength of 40,000 and employ the highest number of Indians outside India. In addition to several countries around the world where we have our presence, we also have our business operation in sourcing offices in 5 countries in ASEAN, like Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. And we know the pulse of the market in ASEAN. So this is an outcome. Thank you very much. And I would also tell to the NRIs here, the important decision of the government of India is to treat all NRI investments, non-resident Indian investments, as domestic investments. This has made India a hot investment destination for NRIs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yusuf Ali. You know, we're almost completely out of time, but I must take 1 or 2 questions before I wrap up. Please, your hand came up first. So we'll take about 3 questions, and please address who you would like the question to be answered by.
I don't know, as a moderator, you can decide who can answer my question, but I don't know whether they're able to answer my question, because it's quite a sensitive question. Okay, my question is why India is so protectionist in its trade policy. There's even a slogan, be Indian, buy Indian. This is the slogan. So that means they encourage the citizens only to buy Indian products. So even I watched some Indian talk shows through cable, of course, and the moderator is supposed to have a balanced view. But when he has 2 groups, one who buys Indian products versus one who buys foreign products, the way he runs the talk will be the one who buys Indian products will be more of an Indian than the one who buys foreign country products. Although he don't say it, but you can see the way he runs the show. My thing is, if you have an open policy, let the market forces decide on your products. So this will give a better quality. Currently, I'm not saying Indian products are not good quality. It will give a much better quality, and also give a good access for their own locals to have a better quality product. And there's no term such as export quality. Because in India, I know there's a term called export quality. So the local Indians can also access for good quality products. Thank you.
Yeah, but just before you go on, I just want to say that I think this Be Indian, Buy Indian was by Gandhi during the,
True.
You're not even old enough to be alive during that moment. But to tell you the truth, if you really look at it, I had a big issue because recently because India was giving all its new contracts to foreign contractors because Indian manufacturers didn't qualify. So we had to get Indian manufacturers to qualify, which is why we are the most open country in the world. Do you actually think that China allows Google and Apple and everybody, such Microsoft, such a free run? That's why so many enterprises were started. So please look at the big picture that India is one of the most open countries in the world. We allow most of the imports now in almost every sector can come in. It's not that regulated. The only thing is that we really find a lot of difficulty in entering into trade agreements, because if you look at it, that again, I think as Sachita said, what India has as an expertise is in services, which many countries want to control and they don't allow. The next thing is we have to be protectionist for our farmers, because if you see, they're far behind. And if you see, no one is more protectionist about farm than US. And so if you look at the big picture, what you said is actually fundamentally wrong on many levels. So be very assured and be very proud that be proud Indian, because India is the freest country that allows everything. Wait. Do you have anything to add?
No, just a quick comment. I would say that when you do international business, first you need to familiarize yourself with the history of the nation. India from 1947, for the first 50 years roughly in its 5-year plans, followed a policy which was called core sector build-up and import substitution. And it has earned that reputation at that point in time. But from the mid-80s and from the 90s, the liberalization has completely opened, and that's not the situation. So every country moves from that particular phase into a more liberalized phase. But today, if you talk about it, she's absolutely right. That's my brief answer.
With this, so if you want, we'll take another question. I'm sure there'll be more. But great question, because it triggered so much passion. Anyone else? Yeah.
So, I'm just trying to get some clarity of thought, and I don't know if this is a question at all. See, as I go around in ASEAN, I see a lot of tea, and it's chai. India is famous for chai. And if the same tea is packed in TWG bags, then it sells. Whereas if it comes as, say, for example, pardon me this, as Tata tea, I don't see it in the market spaces except in Mustafa here in Singapore. I've not understood. India has got a great marketing capability. It has some of the best advertising agencies. Why is that service not available to India to market in ASEAN, or for ASEAN markets, products to be marketed in India like the other gentleman talked about? Now, this is I don't understand this. So can someone clarify?
So can I just give you one answer to this from the Indonesia perspective? So we totally agree with what you're saying, sir. But this is where the tariff barriers and the non-trade barriers come in. So for example, many ASEAN countries require product registration, which is a very complicated process. Every product coming has to be registered, and if you have 4 flavors of tea, all 4 have to be registered. Indonesia has right now a state-run healthcare system, social healthcare system, which is going bankrupt because the cost of medicine, 1 vaccination in Indonesia is the equivalent of 8 vaccinations in India. But they will refuse to allow our big generic companies, great companies like Dr. Reddy's, and so there are these barriers. So beyond the, the general platitudes and seminars, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, they have erected tremendous barriers. But like I showed you, when we have $10 billion minus deficit, according to me, we are, with Indonesia, their favored customer. We are their big customer. So it requires strong negotiation, and we are all waiting for Mr. Modi to come. Unfortunately, he has visited 60 countries in the world, but he has not yet come to Indonesia. So I have personally written to him, and hopefully he will come this year, and I guarantee you, once he comes, and this number is on the table, he will push things.
Actually, to give you a great story about your Indonesian premier, when he came to India and he saw the price of meat in India, he actually worked the FTAs in such this thing that overnight he changed the regulations, and India is one of the largest exporters because you were buying the same buffalo meat from Australia. So I think that when you talk about tariff barriers, it takes action at the highest level.
G2G, yeah,
yes,
correct.
yes.
Thank you.
You sure?
Yeah, I'll just combine the 2 questions. Like the first gentleman mentioned, like why do be Indian, buy Indian kind of stuff. I would say every country today is kind of nationalistic. So it's not just to do with India. We see it US, we see it in ASEAN countries, or we see it in India. So it's nothing new. On the other hand, I would say for the long run, you need to balance between your national and regional priorities. You cannot go regional, compromising your national situation. Second, the trade agreements, they have a lot of political aspects for that. You cannot go and open up your agriculture sector because you have farmers to take care of. And these farmers are going to vote you in the next election. So if you don't take care of these farmers, they won't vote you in the next election. So how do you balance this political economy problem? And last, about the TWG, the question, the main part for that is, again, every country wants to protect its own company. India, like you mentioned, Tata tea is a big one. Darjeeling tea, that's a big area of tea production. Same for ASEAN, tea production is also big. And what the main thing that ASEAN and India should do in this tea kind of commodity is they need to harmonize the standards. Every country has its own regulation for tea. And for trade negotiation, it's not negotiated as a tea, as a Lipton tea packet. It's negotiated in parts of those tea packets. Tea leaf, then how they are taken out from the farming area, how they are packaged, how they are sealed, and there are 3 or 4 categories. There are 10,000 products in a trade negotiation for only traded goods. So it's a very complicated process. You may fail to negotiate if you a complete Lipton tea package if you fail in any of these processes. So it's not just you are negotiating for the Lipton tea packet to come to ASEAN.
Specifically talking about tea.
I'd like to make a very quick comment.
Yeah.
We're the world's second largest beverage company, but
Yeah.
Tata's brand sells under Tetley, so that's a British brand which sells all over, including Indonesia and everywhere. The question on tea, I can have a long chat because I spent 6 years of my career in it later, if you have time. But just a quick point. When you brand a product, value add to it, you really don't have much of a problem. It's about getting consumer franchise and acceptance. But if you're talking about trading on raw, basically tea as a commodity, then I think the trade regulations do play out much more. That's the point.
Thanks. So, we'll come to the end of it. If you want, since you stood up, please go ahead.
Okay.
You have one question.
Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for sharing valuable information. Answer. I'm Karthik. I'm running an education startup in Tier 2 cities in India. Just want to ask something related to the education side. We were discussing about the goods and then product across Asian and then Indian collaboration, right? What are the opportunities for the education? It's not for the traditional one, like the startups are right now doing a lot of wonderful jobs in the education sector. And they're really providing a lot of innovative education for the higher education. And then it can bring a lot of values for the Tier 2 and Asian countries as well. What are the opportunities is there for cross-border or sharing the talent, the skill development across the Asian and India?
So,
I
one
can
of the
answer
things,
because I do some work on education. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
So there is a huge demand for education because, let's say again, if you look at a country like Indonesia, the inequality is very high. So there are people who are looking for, education in India, which is affordable, very good quality. All of us have studied in India, and we are fine. We have done very well in our lives. Yes. And we came through the Indian education system. So, in the morning somebody was saying we had to mug up things and we had to do by rote. But whatever it is, we are on this panel, right? Along with the people who came from Harvard and whatever. So there is a demand. But I think what happens is that it has not been promoted or packaged very well. So just like tourism, there has to be Indian education. You have to explain, for example, VIT, Vellore Institute of Technology. The moment I suggest to somebody, please go and Google and see, the decision is already made. It's a fantastic university. However, from the government side, it is never highlighted. So there is an important need for the government, just like tourism, to promote education. That's on the ASEAN students going to India. And second, also on things like vocational training and all. There are lots of good examples. When with TCS, they have this thing called job-ready training in the final semesters of education, right? Now that's a great example of stepping up, which countries like Indonesia, Thailand don't have. So there are those type of models which can be easily replicated to mutual advantage.
So let me put that in, I agree with everything they've said, but there's really still issues among the recognition of our degrees in different countries. And this kind of thing is being, is actually being worked out with SICA and the mutual recognition agreements, which need to take place before, when they come in, especially in terms of medical degrees, dental, other technical areas. So there is some challenges in this, but the opportunities of training the number of people, and I'd like to close actually on that comment. I think we've overshot, but just please understand this, that we're looking at, when Mr. Rao said this $250 billion worth of opportunity, what I also want to point out is that this region, with India, with the ASEAN has a GDP currently of about 2.5 trillion, all the ASEAN countries. India is 2.4 trillion. We're really looking at 5 trillion, but this is the 5th and 6th largest economies, if you take them in together in the world. And then what happens is the growth potential. If you see India, for instance, there's 600 million Indians who are under 30 years of age today. And what will happen is that while the rest of the world, what they say is that the population of the world will even out at about 8.2 billion, and this will take place sometime in 2030, and at 2030 to 2038. But India will still continue, its population will still be plus for another 10 years. So at 2040, what you will find is that 20% of youngsters under 30 in the world will be Indians. And I think that's a huge number. And the second largest will be from ASEAN. So what we're looking at is that this population needs to have solutions of everything that we spoke about, that every one of these, food will be important. When you talk about the services and servitization, how it will blur, how we're going to look at training and seeing how we can move these people. But more than anything else, I think we're looking at the biggest opportunity for the world in terms of giving them, whether it's healthcare or tourism or leisure or any number of these products that get produced, cars and two-wheelers and everything. So we're really here today at the sweet spot of the world that has opportunities, and these trade partnerships of what we're talking about today will define how we're going to be, how the rest of the world will play out, because this is the region which is the most active today, that has the highest growth rates in the world today, and this is something that I want you all to take home, that it's that this part of the discussion really assumes a lot of importance, and you should take it to even cook it into your business plans. Try and influence the people that you work with, that your corporators, the politicians, that what we have to look at is the big picture, that this is where it comes down to, are we creating jobs, are we creating good quality jobs, and how are we improving the life of people in ASEAN and India. So thank you very much for being here with us.
One comment on a lighter vein.
We'll close
for
with
the
that.
gentleman who
You
no,
can
just
take
one
it
lighter
offline.
comment, just a light comment. India has the potential to
Not
be the
right.
largest supplier of maths and English teachers to the world. Please work on it.